I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into my backyard that Tuesday morning and felt like I was being watched. My name is Xavier Daniels, and I had lived in the Pleasant Grove subdivision in Charlotte, North Carolina for 3 years without any major issues. The neighborhood was relatively quiet, the houses were well maintained, and aside from the occasional complaint about trash cans being left out too long, the HOA had stayed out of my business. That was about to change in the most invasive way imaginable. I was standing there in my boxer shorts and a ratty college t-shirt, coffee mug in hand, just trying to enjoy the early June morning before heading to work at the engineering firm downtown. That's when I noticed them. 6 black dome cameras, brand new by the look of them, mounted on tall poles that had been installed along the fence line, separating my property from the community common area. Every single one of them was angled directly at my backyard. I stood there frozen, my coffee getting cold as I stared at these intrusive devices. My backyard wasn't huge, maybe a quarter acre, but it was my private space. I had a small patio with a grill, a fire pit, some lawn chairs, and a hot tub that I had installed last year. The cameras had a clear view of everything. I could even see tiny red lights blinking on a few of them, indicating they were already recording. My first instinct was to assume there had been some mistake. Maybe they were pointed the wrong way. Maybe they were supposed to monitor the common area, and someone had screwed up the installation. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA management office, fully expecting this to be resolved with a simple phone call. The woman who answered introduced herself as Patricia from Greenfield Management Services. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, describing the cameras and asking if there had been some kind of error in their placement. "Oh no, Mr. Daniels," Patricia said in a tone that was far too cheerful for what she was telling me. "Those cameras were installed by order of the HOA board. They're monitoring the common areas for security purposes." "They're not monitoring the common areas," I said, my voice rising slightly. "They're pointed directly at my backyard, my private property. I can see them right now, and every single one has a perfect view of my patio, my hot tub, my entire yard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, Mr. Daniels, the cameras are installed on HOA property, so they're perfectly within their rights to place them there. If you have concerns, you can bring them up at the next board meeting." "The next board meeting isn't for 3 weeks," I said. "I'm not going to have cameras recording my private property for 3 weeks while I wait to file a complaint." "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do about it today," Patricia said, her tone shifting from cheerful to dismissive. "You'll need to take it up with the board." I hung up, frustration already building in my chest. This wasn't right. I didn't need to be a lawyer to know that having cameras pointed at someone's private property was crossing a line. I spent the rest of the morning getting ready for work, but I couldn't stop thinking about those cameras. Every time I walked past a window that faced the backyard, I could see them there, their dark lenses like unblinking eyes. At work, I couldn't concentrate. My colleague Martin noticed I was distracted during our project meeting and asked if everything was okay. I gave him the abbreviated version and he whistled low. "Man, that's sketchy," he said. "My brother-in-law is a lawyer. Does real estate stuff, property disputes, that kind of thing. You want his number?" I did. That evening, I called James Holloway, who practiced law in a firm in downtown Charlotte. I explained the situation, and he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Xavier, what you're describing is potentially a serious invasion of privacy," he said. "North Carolina has specific laws about surveillance and expectation of privacy. If these cameras are recording areas where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, like your backyard, especially areas where you might be in various states of undress like near a hot tub, that's a problem." "So what do I do?" I asked. "First, document everything. Take photos, videos, note the angles of the cameras. Second, send a formal written complaint to the HOA board and the management company. Be specific about your concerns and request immediate removal or reorientation of the cameras. Third, if they don't respond appropriately, you may need to consider legal action. A lawsuit? Possibly. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Sometimes a strongly worded letter from an attorney is enough to make people reconsider their actions." That night, I went into my backyard with my phone and took extensive photos and videos of each camera, documenting their angles and positions. I even used a ladder to get up to eye level with my second-floor bedroom window, which also faced the backyard. From that vantage point, the camera's positioning was even more obvious. They weren't pointed at the walking paths or the common area. They were pointed at my house. I spent the next evening drafting a formal complaint letter. I kept it professional but firm, citing my concerns about privacy and requesting immediate action. I sent it via certified mail to both the HOA board president and Greenfield Management Services. Then I waited. 3 days later, I received a response. It came in the form of a letter from someone named Helen Whitmore, who identified herself as the HOA board president. The letter was 2 paragraphs long and essentially told me that the cameras were for community safety, were positioned on HOA property, and were therefore not subject to my approval. The letter concluded by reminding me that as a homeowner in Pleasant Grove, I was subject to all HOA rules and regulations, and that failure to comply with board decisions could result in fines. I read the letter 3 times, my anger growing with each pass. Not only were they refusing to address my concerns, but they were threatening me with fines. For what? For asking them not to surveil my private property? I called James Holloway again and read him the letter. "Well, they've made their position clear," he said. "And it's not a good one from a legal standpoint. I think it's time I send them a letter on behalf of the firm. Are you prepared to potentially take this further if they still refuse to cooperate?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. James drafted a formal legal letter that laid out the specific privacy violations, cited relevant North Carolina statutes, and gave the HOA 10 days to remove or reposition the cameras before we would proceed with legal action. The letter was thorough, professional, and made it clear that we were serious. A week passed with no response. Then on day 8, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, informing me that I was in violation of community standards for excessive noise complaints and unapproved exterior modifications. The notice claimed I had been playing loud music late at night and had installed outdoor lighting without board approval. Both claims were completely fabricated. I rarely played music outside, and certainly not late at night. The only outdoor lighting I had were the standard patio lights that had come with the house when I bought it. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I took photos of the notice and sent them to James immediately. His response was quick and direct. "They're escalating. This strengthens your case. Document everything and don't engage with them directly." The following day was Saturday, and I decided to do some yard work despite the cameras watching my every move. I was trimming the hedges along the fence line when I heard a voice call out from the other side. "Excuse me, Mr. Daniels?" I looked up to see a woman in her late 40s standing on the walking path that ran behind my property. She had the kind of haircut that screamed middle management, a blonde bob with highlights that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. She was wearing a crisp white polo shirt with the Pleasant Grove HOA logo embroidered on it and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Can I help you?" I asked, setting down my hedge trimmers. "I'm Helen Whitmore, the HOA board president. We haven't formally met." Of course, her name was Helen. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked closer to the fence, maintaining a polite but cool distance. "I know who you are," I said. "I received your letter." "Yes, well, I wanted to speak with you in person about this situation." "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "You installed 6 cameras that are pointed directly at my private property. That's an invasion of privacy, and I've asked you to remove them. Instead, you've refused and started issuing fake violations against me." Helen's expression hardened. "Those violations are not fake, Mr. Daniels. We've had multiple complaints from your neighbors." "Which neighbors?" I asked. "I'd like their names." "That information is confidential because they don't exist," I said flatly. "This is retaliation for me complaining about your surveillance system." "The cameras are there for everyone's safety," Helen said, her voice taking on a condescending tone. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, and the board decided that additional security measures were necessary." "Then why are all 6 cameras pointed at my yard specifically?" I asked. "Why not distribute them around the community if this is about general safety?" "The cameras are positioned to provide optimal coverage of the common areas." "That's a lie, and you know it," I said, my patience wearing thin. "I've documented the angle of every single camera. They're pointed at my house, my patio, my hot tub. If I'm in my backyard, you're recording me." "That's illegal." Helen's face flushed red. "How dare you accuse the board of illegal activity? We are volunteers who dedicate our time to maintaining property values and community standards. If you don't like our decisions, you're free to move." "I'm not moving," I said. "But those cameras are coming down one way or another." "We'll see about that," Helen said, turning on her heel and walking away. I stood there watching her go, my heart pounding. This was getting worse, not better. I went inside and immediately called James to tell him about the confrontation. "This is good, actually," James said. "She admitted on record, to you directly, that the cameras are positioned where they are. That's going to help us. But Xavier, I need to warn you. If we proceed with a lawsuit, this is going to get expensive for them, and they're going to fight it. HOA boards hate admitting they're wrong. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I'm sure," I said. "This isn't just about me anymore. If they're willing to do this to me, they'll do it to other homeowners. Someone needs to stop them." "All right then. I'll start drafting the complaint. We're going to sue for invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and harassment. We'll also seek an injunction to have the cameras removed immediately." Over the next 2 weeks, James and his firm prepared the lawsuit. During that time, the HOA issued 2 more violation notices against me. One claimed my grass was too long, which was absurd because I mowed every week. The other claimed I was parking my car on the street overnight, which was technically true for one night when I had friends over for dinner and they had taken up the driveway spots. But according to the HOA rules I had reviewed, overnight street parking was allowed up to 3 consecutive nights. I was well within the rules, but they were citing me anyway. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I didn't pay them. Instead, I documented them and added them to our growing case file. The lawsuit was filed on a Monday morning in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. By that afternoon, I received an angry phone call from Patricia at the management company. "Mr. Daniels, we've been served with a lawsuit," she said, her previous cheerfulness completely gone. "This is extremely inappropriate. The board is very upset." "The board should be upset with themselves for violating my privacy," I said. "They had multiple opportunities to resolve this reasonably. The board intends to fight this vigorously. You should know that." "I'm counting on it," I said and hung up. The legal process moved slowly at first. The HOA hired a law firm called Morrison & Burke to represent them. Their first move was to file a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had sovereign immunity as a quasi-governmental organization, and that I had failed to exhaust all internal remedies before suing. James filed a response that systematically destroyed both arguments. The HOA was not a governmental entity, quasi or otherwise, and I had attempted to resolve the issue through internal channels multiple times before filing suit. The judge agreed and denied the motion to dismiss. Discovery began, and that's when things got interesting. Through the legal process, we were able to request all documents related to the camera installation, including the proposal, the board meeting minutes where it was discussed and approved, and all communications about the project. What we found was damning. The camera system had cost the HOA $32,000. The vendor proposal clearly stated that the cameras should be positioned to monitor the walking paths, parking areas, and community entrances. But the board meeting minutes revealed that Helen Whitmore had specifically requested the cameras be positioned to monitor my property. The reason, according to the minutes, Helen claimed that I was running some kind of business out of my home that violated HOA rules and that the cameras were needed to document this violation. This was completely fabricated. I worked a regular 9-to-5 job at an engineering firm. I didn't run any business from home. Even more interesting, we discovered through discovery that Helen and I had history that I had completely forgotten about. 2 years earlier, when I first moved into the neighborhood, I had filed a complaint about her dog, a large German Shepherd, that kept getting loose and coming into my yard. Animal control had gotten involved and Helen had been fined. Apparently, she had held a grudge ever since. This was personal retaliation disguised as community safety, and now we had the documents to prove it. James was thrilled. "This is better than I hoped," he said during one of our meetings. "This isn't just a privacy violation. This is targeted harassment by an HOA board president abusing her position for personal revenge. The damages are going to be significant." As the case progressed, the stress began to affect my daily life. I felt uncomfortable in my own home. I stopped using my backyard entirely because I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had to close all my blinds facing the back of the house, which made my home feel dark and claustrophobic. I wasn't sleeping well. My work performance suffered. James suggested I see a therapist to document the emotional distress, which I did. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, a licensed psychologist in Charlotte, diagnosed me with anxiety directly related to the surveillance situation. Her report would become part of our damages claim. 4 months after filing the lawsuit, we were scheduled for mediation. This was a mandatory step before trial where both sides would meet with a neutral mediator to try to reach a settlement. The mediation took place in a conference room at the mediator's office in Uptown Charlotte. I arrived with James and his associate, Emily Chen. The HOA showed up with Helen Whitmore, 2 other board members I didn't recognize, Patricia from the management company, and their 2 attorneys from Morrison and Burke. The mediator, a retired judge named Richard Foster, explained the process and then separated us into different rooms. For the next 6 hours, he went back and forth between the rooms, carrying offers and counteroffers. The HOA's opening position was insulting. They offered to remove 2 of the 6 cameras and pay me $500 for my trouble. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and agree not to pursue the matter further. James didn't even bring me this offer. He told the mediator it was rejected and sent back a counteroffer. Remove all cameras immediately, issue a formal public apology, pay $50,000 in damages, and reimburse all my attorney fees. The HOA called this extortion. The mediation went nowhere. We left after 8 hours with no settlement. "We're going to trial," James said as we walked to our cars, "and honestly, Xavier, I think we're going to win big. Their position is indefensible, and they're too stubborn to see it." The trial was scheduled for early December, about 9 months after I first noticed the cameras. In the weeks leading up to trial, the neighborhood tension was palpable. Some of my neighbors approached me quietly to express support. Others avoided me entirely. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived 3 houses down, told me that Helen had been going door to door trying to rally people against me, claiming I was trying to bankrupt the HOA and raise everyone's dues. "I told her she brought this on herself," Frank said. "Most of us think what she did was wrong. But she's got a few allies on the board who are backing her up." The trial began on a cold Monday morning. The Mecklenburg County Courthouse was busy, filled with lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and families. Our case was assigned to Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for being fair but tough. Jury selection took most of the first day. We ended up with a jury of 8 people, a mix of men and women, young and old. James was pleased with the selection. "They look like reasonable people," he whispered to me. "That's all we need." The trial itself was fascinating and nerve-wracking in equal measure. James presented our case methodically. He called me as the first witness, and I testified about discovering the cameras, my attempts to resolve the issue, and the impact it had on my life. I explained how I felt violated in my own home, how I couldn't use my backyard anymore, how I had to keep my blinds closed constantly. The HOA's attorneys tried to paint me as overly sensitive and litigious, but James had prepared me well. I stayed calm and factual in my responses. Dr. Mitchell testified about my anxiety and the psychological impact of the surveillance. James also called a surveillance technology expert who examined the cameras and testified that they were positioned in a way that could not be justified for general security purposes. Their angle and zoom capabilities meant they were specifically monitoring my property, not the common areas. Then came the HOA's turn to present their defense. Helen Whitmore took the stand, and this is where things fell apart for them. Under James's cross-examination, Helen became defensive and combative. She insisted the cameras were for legitimate security purposes, but when James showed her the board meeting minutes where she specifically requested the cameras be pointed at my property, she fumbled. "I may have requested that," she admitted, "but it was because we had concerns about Mr. Daniels's activities." "What activities?" James asked. "We believed he might be running a business from his home." "What evidence did you have of this?" "We had received complaints." "From whom?" "I don't recall specifically. Did you ever verify these complaints?" "We felt the cameras would help us verify them." "So you spent $32,000 of HOA funds to install a surveillance system to monitor one homeowner based on unverified complaints you can't remember?" Helen's face turned red. "We were acting in the best interests of the community." James then showed the jury the animal control records from 2 years earlier, establishing the personal grudge. He showed the timeline of fake violations issued against me. He showed the camera footage itself, which the HOA had been forced to turn over during discovery, showing clear recordings of my backyard, my patio, and even through some of my windows. The HOA's attorneys tried to recover by arguing that the cameras were on HOA property, and therefore the HOA had the right to place them wherever they wanted. But James countered with North Carolina case law, establishing that surveillance of private property where someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy is illegal, regardless of where the camera is physically located. The trial lasted 4 days. Closing arguments were on Thursday afternoon. James was brilliant. tying together all the evidence into a narrative of abuse of power, personal vendetta, and serious privacy violations. The HOA's attorney argued that the board had acted in good faith, even if their judgment was perhaps flawed, and that the damages I was seeking were excessive. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. They found in my favor on all counts: invasion of privacy, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages awarded were stunning: $75,000 in compensatory damages, $50,000 in punitive damages, and full reimbursement of attorney fees, which by that point had exceeded $40,000. I sat there in shock as the judge thanked the jury and entered the judgment: $165,000 plus attorney fees. The $32,000 camera system had cost the HOA nearly $200,000 total. Helen Whitmore looked like she might faint. The other board members were pale. Their attorneys looked grim but unsurprised. Outside the courthouse, James shook my hand firmly. "That's one of the better verdicts I've gotten in a case like this," he said. The jury was clearly offended by what the HOA did, and that punitive damages award sends a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. "What happens now?" I asked. "They have 30 days to file an appeal, but I doubt they will. If they do, we'll fight it. But the facts and law are so clearly on our side that an appeal would likely just cost them more money. Most likely, they'll pay the judgment and remove the cameras." Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The HOA's insurance company, after reviewing the case, decided not to cover the judgment because the board had acted maliciously rather than negligently. This meant the HOA would have to pay out of their operating funds. An emergency special assessment was levied against all homeowners in Pleasant Grove to cover the judgment. Each of the 230 homes in the subdivision had to pay approximately $700 to cover the costs of Helen Whitmore's vendetta against me. The homeowners were not happy. Within 2 weeks of the special assessment notice going out, a petition was circulated calling for the recall of the entire HOA board. The petition got enough signatures and a special election was held in February. Helen Whitmore and her 2 allies on the board were removed. A completely new board was elected, including Frank, my neighbor who had supported me. One of their first acts was to have all 6 cameras removed and to issue a formal written apology to me that was included in the HOA newsletter. But the story doesn't end there. In March, I received a call from Detective Sarah Kim with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. She explained that during a review of HOA financial records related to the judgment payment, irregularities had been discovered. The district attorney's office had gotten involved, and they had questions about the camera system contract. It turned out that Helen Whitmore had a personal relationship with the owner of the security company that installed the cameras. Not only that, but she had received a kickback of $8,000 for awarding the contract. The $32,000 system should have cost closer to $18,000 based on market rates. Helen had deliberately chosen an overpriced vendor in exchange for a personal payment using HOA funds for her own enrichment. This was embezzlement and fraud. The investigation expanded, revealing that Helen had also been inflating vendor invoices for landscaping and pool maintenance, pocketing the difference. Over her 3-year tenure as board president, she had stolen approximately $35,000 from the HOA. In April, Helen Whitmore was arrested. I wasn't there to see it, but Frank told me about it later. The police showed up at her house early in the morning, and she was led out in handcuffs while her neighbors watched. The image of Helen, who had been so righteous and condescending about community standards, being arrested for theft, was something Frank said he would never forget. Helen was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft by deception. The evidence was overwhelming. She initially tried to fight the charges, but eventually accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to felony embezzlement and was sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to make full restitution to the HOA for all stolen funds. The new HOA board filed their own lawsuit against Helen and won a judgment for the stolen funds plus damages. Her house in Pleasant Grove went up for sale shortly after her conviction. I heard she ended up serving 20 months before being paroled. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The cameras came down in January, about 11 months after they had first been installed. The first time I stepped into my backyard without those electronic eyes watching me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized had been so heavy. I started using my backyard again. I fired up the grill on a Saturday in late March, invited some friends over, and we sat around the fire pit until late in the evening, enjoying the privacy I had fought so hard to protect. My anxiety decreased. I stopped seeing Dr. Mitchell after a few more sessions. I opened my blinds and let natural light back into my house. The judgment money from the lawsuit arrived in April. After paying James his fees and reimbursing myself for various costs, I had about $90,000 left. I thought about taking a vacation, maybe doing some home renovations, but in the end, I decided to do something more meaningful. I donated $20,000 to a legal aid organization that helped homeowners fight HOA abuses. These organizations often struggled for funding, and I wanted to help other people who might not have the resources I had to fight back against overreaching HOAs. With some of the remaining money, I installed a proper fence around my entire backyard, a tall privacy fence made of cedar that would age beautifully. I also put in a small vegetable garden and upgraded my patio with a new outdoor kitchen setup. My backyard became the private oasis I had always wanted it to be. The neighborhood changed after everything that happened. The new HOA board was much more reasonable and transparent. They held regular meetings that were actually open to homeowners, published detailed financial reports, and made decisions based on consensus rather than the whims of one vindictive board president. Property values in Pleasant Grove actually increased because people felt more comfortable buying homes there, knowing the HOA was now functioning properly. I became something of a local legend in the neighborhood. People I had never met before would stop me during walks and thank me for standing up to Helen. Some shared their own stories of petty violations and harassment they had endured, but had been too afraid to challenge. One woman told me Helen had fined her repeatedly for the color of her front door curtains, claiming they violated the community aesthetic standards. Even though there was no such rule in the HOA bylaws, Frank was elected as the new HOA president, and he did an excellent job. One of the things he implemented was a homeowner bill of rights that was added to the HOA governing documents. It included provisions protecting homeowner privacy, establishing clear procedures for violations and appeals, requiring financial transparency, and limiting the board's authority to take actions without homeowner input. In the summer, the neighborhood held a community barbecue, the first one in years according to longtime residents. It was held in the common area behind my house, ironically right where those cameras had been installed. People brought food, kids ran around playing, and there was live music from a local band. During the event, Frank got up and gave a short speech thanking everyone for coming together as a community, and specifically thanked me for having the courage to hold the previous board accountable. I felt embarrassed by the attention, but also proud. I hadn't asked for any of this. All I had wanted was to enjoy my morning coffee in peace without being surveilled. But in fighting for that simple right, I had helped create positive change for an entire community. Life lessons came from this experience that I hadn't expected to learn. I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult and expensive and stressful, is worth it. I learned that bullies often back down when confronted with real consequences. I learned that HOA boards, despite whatever authority they think they have, are still bound by laws and basic human decency. I also learned the importance of documentation. If I hadn't taken those photos and videos, if I hadn't kept copies of every letter and notice, if I hadn't documented the impact on my mental health, the case would have been much harder to prove. Evidence matters, and creating a clear paper trail of wrongdoing was crucial to my victory. Most importantly, I learned that communities function best when there's accountability and transparency. Helen Whitmore was able to abuse her power because she faced no oversight and no consequences for years. The moment homeowners started paying attention and demanding accountability, things improved dramatically. By the fall, Pleasant Grove felt like a different place. The paranoia and pettiness that had characterized the old board's regime were gone. People were friendlier, more engaged, and actually proud of their community again. The HOA still existed and still had rules, but they were enforced fairly and reasonably, the way they should be. I received a few calls from journalists who had heard about the case and wanted to write articles about it. One story ran in the Charlotte Observer under the headline, "HOA President's Vendetta Costs Community Thousands." Another appeared in a national publication about property rights. I did a few interviews, hoping that sharing my story might help others in similar situations realize they had options and didn't have to accept HOA overreach. Some people reached out to me directly. homeowners from around the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I tried to help where I could, offering advice and connecting people with attorneys. I wasn't trying to become some kind of anti-HOA crusader, but if my experience could help others, I was happy to share it. One particularly memorable message came from a woman in Florida whose HOA was fining her because her grass was the wrong shade of green. Not too long, not too brown, but literally the wrong shade of green according to one board member's arbitrary standard. I connected her with a property rights attorney in her area, and last I heard, she was fighting back and the HOA had backed down. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been one of the most stressful, challenging periods of my life, but also one of the most meaningful. I had learned things about myself, about the legal system, about community dynamics, and about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to just accept the status quo. The holidays came, and the neighborhood was decorated beautifully. Helen had always insisted on strict rules about holiday decorations, limiting when they could go up and what colors were acceptable. The new board had eliminated most of these restrictions, and the result was a neighborhood that actually looked festive and welcoming rather than sterile and controlled. I put up lights on my house for the first time in years, and on Christmas Eve, I hosted a small gathering in my backyard. The weather was mild for December in North Carolina, and we were able to sit outside around the fire pit, drinking hot cider and enjoying each other's company. Standing there in my backyard, surrounded by friends and neighbors, no cameras watching, no fear of arbitrary violations, I felt genuinely at peace. The whole ordeal with the cameras seemed almost surreal now, like something that had happened to someone else. But the changes it brought about were very real. My backyard had become more than just a physical space. It represented something larger, the idea that we all deserve privacy, respect, and freedom from harassment in our own homes. In January of the following year, I received the final piece of closure I needed. The HOA's insurance company, which had initially refused to cover the judgment, settled a bad faith lawsuit brought by the HOA for their refusal to provide coverage. That settlement money went back into the HOA's reserves, and the board was able to return most of the special assessment to homeowners. I received a check for $600, my portion of the refund. I donated that money too, this time to a local organization that provided legal education to homeowners about their rights. The cycle continued, using my experience to help others. Frank served 2 years as HOA president before stepping down, satisfied that he had helped restore integrity to the organization. A woman named Caroline took over, and she continued the policies of transparency and fairness. Life in Pleasant Grove became what it should have always been: peaceful, respectful, and community-oriented. The vacant lot where Helen's house had stood after it sold was eventually purchased by a young couple with 2 kids. When they moved in, I went over to introduce myself and welcome them to the neighborhood. They had done their research before buying and knew all about the lawsuit and the changes in the HOA. That's actually why they chose Pleasant Grove, they said. They wanted to live somewhere with a functional HOA that protected homeowners rather than harassing them. As for me, I'm still living in the same house in Pleasant Grove. My backyard is still my sanctuary, my private space where I can relax without worry. The vegetables in my garden grow well. The fire pit gets regular use. The hot tub, which started this whole mess because Helen objected to me using it in my own backyard, remains one of my favorite features of the property. Sometimes, when I'm out there in the evening, I think about those 6 cameras and everything that followed. I think about Helen Whitmore and how her need for control and revenge ultimately destroyed her life. I don't take pleasure in her downfall, but I don't regret standing up to her either. She made her choices, and she faced the consequences. The case became something of a precedent in North Carolina HOA law. James told me that other attorneys were citing our case in their own lawsuits against overreaching HOAs. Judge Morrison's ruling, which strongly affirmed homeowner privacy rights and limited HOA authority, was being used to protect other homeowners across the state. That was perhaps the most satisfying outcome of all. My fight for my own privacy rights had helped establish protections for countless others. The ripple effects of standing up to that HOA board extended far beyond my backyard in Pleasant Grove. I learned that the security company that installed the cameras also faced consequences. After Helen's fraud was exposed, several other HOAs investigated their contracts with the same company and discovered similar kickback schemes. The owner was charged with commercial bribery, and his business collapsed. That was another reminder that corruption rarely exists in isolation. When you pull on one thread, the whole ugly tapestry often unravels. Life moved forward. I got a promotion at work. I started dating someone I met through mutual friends. The neighborhood continued to thrive under competent HOA leadership. The story of the cameras became one of those tales that got told at neighborhood gatherings, a reminder of a dark period and how the community came together to make things right. Years from now, new residents might move into Pleasant Grove and never know about any of this. The cameras are long gone, Helen Whitmore is a fading memory, and the neighborhood looks like any other pleasant suburban community. But those of us who lived through it will always remember. We'll remember the importance of accountability, the value of standing up for your rights, and the power of a community that refuses to accept abuse from those in authority. My backyard remains my favorite place. On quiet mornings, I still take my coffee out there, just like I did that Tuesday morning when I first noticed the cameras. But now, there's no feeling of being watched, no electronic eyes monitoring my every move. There's just the birds, the breeze, the peaceful privacy that every homeowner deserves. The lawsuit that cost the HOA nearly $200,000 over a $32,000 camera system became a cautionary tale. It's cited in HOA management training courses as an example of what happens when board members let personal vendettas override common sense and legal boundaries. It's discussed in law school property classes as a clear case of privacy rights versus organizational authority. For me, though, it's simpler than that. It's about refusing to be bullied in my own home. It's about fighting back when someone violates your basic rights. It's about the principle that your home should be your castle, not a place where you feel constantly surveilled and harassed. The 6 cameras that Helen Whitmore installed to monitor my backyard ended up costing her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and her home. They cost the HOA hundreds of thousands of dollars and created a rift in the community that took years to heal, all because one person couldn't let go of a grudge and thought she was above the law. I hope my story serves as a reminder to HOA board members everywhere that they serve homeowners, not rule over them, that their authority has limits, that privacy matters, that retaliation and harassment have consequences, and that sometimes the cost of being wrong is far greater than the cost of doing right in the first place. As I sit here in my backyard on a beautiful spring evening, the sun setting over the trees, I'm grateful for how everything turned out. The fight was hard, the stress was real, and there were times I questioned whether it was worth it. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. I stood up for myself, I held powerful people accountable, and I helped create positive change. That's worth more than any amount of money. The cameras are gone. Helen Whitmore is gone. The old regime is gone. What remains is a community that's stronger, fairer, and more respectful of homeowners' rights. And my backyard, finally and permanently, is mine again.